good afternoon, and thank you for coming at a time when probably many of you could be doing many more exciting things. And also you should each have a handout with texts, and I usually, or try to refrain from speaking without handouts, because even if people fall asleep during my lecture, they can later on their own free time read the texts, which are quite interesting, in fact. So when I proposed this topic to Dr. Gradesboard, and he, after checking many other options, thought that this was the most appropriate, that was some time ago, and I had no idea that it was going to be actually topical in the news. As some of you may have seen, there is a sort of impasse in the Israeli political scene with the main groups of parties who might be able to form a coalition, sort of split down the middle, and neither of them can get a sufficient majority in order to be able to form a government. And while this was happening, the current Prime Minister, Netanyahu, had an idea that his opponents could conceivably form a government which would have enough votes to be sworn in by the Knesset, by the parliament, if they would be supported by the joint Arab parties who ran together as a bloc during the election. And what he tried to do was to discredit the very idea that any person who had a true commitment to the future of Israel could even imagine to enter into a political arrangement in which Arab parties would support that government, thereby seeking to discredit that option from his main opponent. And in fact, the issue of the place of non-Jewish minorities in the state of Israel is a significant issue. And of course, it's not helped by the fact that it's not purely a local matter within Israel, because Israel has various minorities within it: a Muslim minority, a large Muslim minority, a Christian minority, a Druze minority, and others. But at the same time, Israel is in a state of conflict for many years with various countries all around it, many of whom are themselves primarily Muslim majority states. And so when this places the non-Jewish minority, for the purposes of this discussion, the Muslim minority within Israel, in a problematic situation, do they see themselves, or should they see themselves primarily as citizens of Israel, or as part of the Muslim world around them, which is in a state of conflict with Israel? And this contributes also to the fact that many people, Jewish people in Israel, when they think about the Arab citizens of Israel, are concerned, well, how should we regard them? Be that as it may, we do see that, perhaps similar to what you see in the United States and elsewhere, frequently people who speak in the name of religion regard, or when you look at where they are in the political map, where they're on the right. Okay. And frequently you hear various people speaking in the name of the Jewish religion, and many of them are rabbis, and they are expressing in different ways how they view with suspicion and tend to discredit the loyalty of the Arab minority in Israel, and see them in some way as necessarily in an antagonistic relationship with the Jewish majority. However, what I would like to bring to you today is various sources from Sephardic rabbis. Sephardic, okay, Sepharad is the biblical name for a country. Where that country really was in biblical times, Professor Wright can tell you, but not me. But what did happen is that when Jews reached the Iberian Peninsula, some of them already in the time of the Roman Empire, and they said, oh, we have reached the land of Sepharad. And they regarded the Iberian Peninsula as the biblical Sepharad, and they called themselves Sephardim, meaning inhabitants of Sepharad. And in 1492, Christopher Columbus discovered America, but also something else happened, which is that the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula by the Christian forces was finally complete. And one way of showing their great gratitude to God was to get rid of all the people who aren't Christian. So the Jewish people in Spain, the Sephardim, had the choice that they could either choose the rational thing, which is to be a Catholic and thereby attain true salvation, or they could take their souls elsewhere and live somewhere else. The Spanish kings didn't really care where they went, and some of them went to various places in North Africa. The Ottoman Empire was very welcoming. Some of them wound up in the Southwest, in South America, Central America. There's a lot of people in these areas who say that their forefathers came from Spain and were really of Jewish origin. But most of them went to North Africa and the Middle East, and therefore you have people who are Sephardim, Spanish, but where are they really living? They're living in the Middle East and North Africa. They naturally spoke Arabic, because that's what everybody spoke there, just like people here speak English or Spanish. And what we have before us is a text from 3 rabbis of those areas who wrote in the 20th century about the topic at hand. Rabbi Khalfon Moshe HaCohen, who's the first person you have here, is from the island of Gerba. Okay, where is Gerba?
Tunisia.
Tunisia. Okay, right. It's an island in the southern area of Tunisia, just off the coast. And since processes of modernization in Tunisia happened under French influence, and that came from the north, so people in the north of Tunisia, where, for instance, the city of Tunis is the capital, and many, many years ago, there was a big kingdom there. The capital of it was Carthago, right? So the island of Gerba, which was in the south, was sort of isolated from the rest of the country. You had to get there by boat. I understand that now there's a bridge. And so the Jewish people living there, and also the Muslim people living there, were from a special kind of Muslim persuasion called the Ibadi. And so the Jews living there sort of set up like a nature preserve, and they tried the best they could to not fall into the trap that they perceived of assimilation and modernization. And the most famous and leading rabbi of this community was Rabbi Khalfon Moshe HaCohen. But the fact that he was opposed to various forms of assimilation and modernization doesn't mean that he had antagonistic views of other human beings. And in fact, he writes, "It is right and proper for us to recognize the value of humankind, for God created man in his image. And it is unworthy to be in a state of altercation," meaning fighting or disagreement with any human being, between Jew and fellow Jew, or between Jew and Christian, or between Jew and Muslim, For in all matters relating to humanity and to fostering the well-being of the world, we are brothers. Now, of course, you have that in the American Declaration of Independence. We hold all these things, right, these things to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Probably the better translation would be all humans are created equal. And that seemed to be self-evident in 1776, but where did they get that from? Right, from the first chapter of Genesis, okay, where the whole idea that humankind was created in God's image, whatever that means, but it certainly means something good and positive, and therefore, when you say that about somebody, you're saying that that person has worth and value. And then he gets in a different place into the issue of what will happen when there is established a Jewish polity, which he was very much in favor of. And he writes, with regard to matters of religious praxis and law, they will conduct themselves as they wish, meaning other non-Jewish people. And we will walk in the name of God and follow his holy Torah as written and transmitted. No government has a say with regard to matters pertaining to the soul. Only the body is subject to them. Okay, so this is a religious statement of the separation, I don't know if the separation of church and state, but that the state should not have any say about the spiritual and religious conduct of the citizens. And he said, the land of Israel shall be a national home for the Hebrews, ha'ivrim, and all other peoples therein will also enjoy their rights. And all of Israel in the diaspora, meaning outside of Israel, will also so enjoy in equality with the nations. Okay, and he had an example because France was ruling Tunisia as a colonial power, and he saw and he read in the newspapers that in France, people have an equal civilian status as non-contingent upon their religion, and this, in his imagination, would be the same way when a state for the Jewish nation was established. Everybody would have equal rights. Rabbi Ben Zion Meir Uzziel was born in the old city of Jerusalem in 1880. That's where he grew up. He later became, around the First World War, the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv and Jaffa, which are two cities which in effect form one metropolitan area. And then in 1939, he was chosen as the chief rabbi of the land of Israel, which at that time was under British rule. And in 1948, when Israel became independent, he was the Sephardic chief rabbi, so he became the first Sephardic chief rabbi of the new state of Israel. And he has an interesting, this will come out in the first paragraph in Hebrew very soon. He has a general statement about relationships between human beings in general, and he says the commandment to love one's fellow as oneself, in Hebrew, ve'ahavta le'areacha kamocha, includes, albeit in a more limited measure, all humans created in God's image. Okay, he has the idea of like this concentric circles. So the concentric circle is, okay, I'm supposed to love myself, not feel that I'm a nothing, who am I, I'm a slob. No, people should love themselves and give respect to themselves. And then they have brothers, sisters, parents, their family, an immediate family. Then you have a broader family, then you have your community and the whole country and the whole world, and these are concentric circles. And it's natural that people feel more love for their parents, for instance, than for some other person who is worthy of our love, but is at this moment living somewhere in Bangladesh. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have respect and love and wish to help the people in Bangladesh. But so he says the concentric circles. These concentric circles extend to all of humanity, all humans created in God's image. There is a Torah obligation to seek peace and to pursue peace for every human, and to perform acts of love and compassion that bring all these close to the quality of world peace that is the mission and aspiration of the Israelite people. Love of a person because she or he is human does not differentiate between nation and nation, and all are included in the mitzvah of love. Now this seems very rational when you think that the Bible depicts that all human beings are created in God's image, and therefore they're all in some way brothers and sisters, and there should be a kinship of human beings. But it's not automatically the case that every rabbi you ask everywhere will tell you that. And some rabbis seem to feel that, well, the Torah commands us, meaning the Jews, God gave the Torah to the Jews, therefore all of the commandments in the Torah pertain to Jews. How Jews should relate to other things outside of the Jewish sphere, that's not a concern of Torah. But obviously Rabbi Uzziel did not hold that. He held the broader view. And in the next paragraphs, we have various statements that he made. Well, of course, he was living, right, in the land of Israel, in Palestine. And the first statement that we have, just let me check it again, okay, was a commission after World War I. Okay, so there were discussion, what would happen with the former areas of the Ottoman Empire? The Ottoman Empire, which included the entire Middle East of today, Israel, Jordan, between themselves during the war, that they would not maintain that political framework. They would divide it up into various nation states. And one idea that was raised and ultimately was accepted by the League of Nations was that the various European powers who won the war would get mandates over various territories and prepare them for independence. So Britain got Iraq, what's today Iraq, Jordan, and Israel, Palestine. And France got Lebanon and Syria. And Italy was supposed to get what's now the entire western part of Turkey. The Russians were supposed to get the rest of Turkey, but then what happened in 1917, they opted out of the war because there was the revolution. And they said, we're not continuing to fight this terrible war. And so the Russians, who were supposed to get the eastern part of Turkey of today, didn't get it. And the Italians tried, but Ataturk conducted a war against them. And ultimately, we do have a state of Turkey, but the rest of the area was divided up. So there was a commission in 1919, came to what's now Israel, and they wanted to consult with the local inhabitants what their projected future for that area was. And one of the people that spoke to them was Rabbi Uzziel. And he said, we wish to return. Okay, this is 1919. We wish to return and live our political and spiritual lives in our land, to make the land bloom again, to revive the legal system of the Torah that is full of compassion and mercy toward everyone created in the image of God, a Torah that bestows equality in civil law upon all who reside upon the land, as it is written, and he's quoting from the 4th of the 5 books of Moses. One teaching and one law shall there be for you and for he or she who lives with you. Far be it from us to constrict the steps of anyone. Far be it from us to harm the religious and national sentiments of all peoples, to take away the rights of all citizens. We wish to join hands with all ethnic groups and nations in productive work and to live therein a life of freedom and love and peace. Okay, so this is being written in 1919. And, okay, so if anybody has a question or comment, feel free to make it. Okay, so the fact that I'm speaking doesn't mean that I'm happy to take questions. Yes, sir.
Because I got to go, that's why I was going to say this comment. You said in the beginning about Jews going to the Muslim country and being welcomed.
Excuse me?
The Ottoman Muslim countries and being welcomed.
Yes.
It's not about Moses Maimonides. He was born in Cordova, Spain, 1100, 1200, roughly. You probably know the guy, he was a great rabbi. And he was forced, his family was forced. They were given a choice by the Muslims there, right? They were running it. You either convert or you die, not you convert or you leave. They escaped. They went to an area right next to Cairo, Egypt. And there was Muslims there that allowed him to live because they saw that they had, he was a physician, so he was useful. But they weren't treated very well. So I was wondering why you were saying that.
Okay, first of all, thank you for the question. That wasn't the experience of Maimonides and his family. In fact, his father he was a young man at the time. But you should remember that the Arab armies across the Straits of Gibraltar, which is called after an Arab general, Jebel Tariq, and in 1717 or something like that, and they conquered what's now the Iberian Peninsula, and under their rule, the Jews flourished much more than they had under the Visigoths. Then, around the year 1150, a group of more zealous or extreme Muslims came up from Morocco. They were called the Muwahidun, and they did not hold the generally relaxed, laid-back attitude that was through the entire Muslim world at that time. The center of Jewish life from in the entire world from the year 650 for about 400 or 500 years was in Iraq, which was the capital and center of the Abbasid Empire, and the Jews did very well there. The Geonim, they were the world center of Judaism at that time. There were very few Jews in Europe. So there was, in fact, this thing, and then what happened with Muhammad was that they went through Morocco, and at that time, many scholars hold they were forced or felt they had no choice but to convert to Islam outwardly, and then they went from Morocco in the west to Cairo in the east of Africa, northeast of Africa, and Egypt was under a different Muslim ruler who continued the basic tradition of Islam to recognize both Jews and Christians as a people who were treated well, quite relatively to most other places at that time. And so the Ottoman Empire in 1492 was very welcoming to the Jewish refugees from Spain. And this also had to do because the Muslims had not too long before finally completed their conquest of the remnant of the Byzantine Empire in 1453. And they were trying to encourage economic activity and a lot of other activities. And so the Muslims were very welcoming to the Jews from the Spanish refugees. And that's why in the eyes of many Jews in Europe, when they think of Sephardim, they're thinking about Jews from the Middle East, and not thinking about Jews from Spain. they're thinking about Jews in the Middle East because that's the Jews who came there to the Ottoman Empire. Okay, okay, okay. So, so you might say that if Rabbi Uzziel was talking this way to the commission that came in 1919 and how everything would be hunky-dory and we really, Torah loves the non-Jews and they're going to have equality and so on, you might think that that was because he wanted to encourage them to bring back a positive report to the League of Nations, and then the League of Nations would endorse the idea that the British would have a mandate over Palestine, one of which to make it into a national home for the Jewish people. But if we follow through, we see that, no, he maintained this position consistently. And the next section is from a responsum, that's a legal position paper, that was published in 1940. And before I continue, I want to put you into place that in 1940, the World War II had broken out. But between 1936 and 1939, a large part, not all, but a large part of the Arab population under the British Mandate of Palestine had decided to carry out a rebellion against the British because they felt that the British should be granting them independence, just like the British had done in 1933 for the people in Iraq. And they did something which in the Palestinian and Arab vocabulary is called the Great Uprising or Rebellion of 1936-39. And during that rebellion, there was a lot of fighting between the British and the Arabs, but there was a lot of fighting between the Jews and the Arabs, because also the Arabs thought that the Jews were allied with the British and vice versa. So when Rabbi Uzziel was writing this brief in 1940, this should be understood that he's writing it after all of this happened. And what he's writing is that one of the greatest aspirations, okay, he's talking here about what will be the legal system of the future state of Israel, which he believed was going to happen quite soon. It's 1940. In fact, in 1948, it happened. He didn't know at that time what was going to happen in the middle, meaning the Holocaust and so on. So one of the greatest aspirations of the Israelite people is the redemption of the Israelite legal system to resurrect the laws of Torah. One of the most important goals of the redemption is, I shall restore your judges as in the beginning. If so, when the legal system is returned to us and Israel's judges shall sit in judgment and Torah will be sovereign in all matters of interpersonal adjudication, will we be able then to accept the testimony of a non-Jew as ground for our judgment? So, okay, you have to realize that since sometime in the first century before the Common Era, there had never been an independent Jewish state. So the Jewish legal system never had to really deal with these issues. What was in biblical times is a different thing, which is an interesting question, but the legal system as it exists under rabbinic interpretation law never had to really contend with a situation in which there would be a Jewish polity that would have to apply the rules to a non-Jewish population. Yes, sir?
What about the Noahide Laws? That's been around for forever.
Well, first of all, the Noahide Laws, if you look in the Bible, you won't find them. You will find that the rabbis in Talmudic times read into certain verses when God is talking to Noah. They read into certain verses 7 basic rules of proper human life, and later on, this became a view of how all human beings who are not Jewish should follow these rules, but that was never under any Jewish polity, okay? And non-Jewish some people today think that that would be a good idea, but it's like very basic moral rules. But it's not because any political framework is imposing that. I mean, people should choose to be good, not to kill, not to murder, not to have sex with animals and their sister, and so on. So that's like to establish a system of justice, but what will be the specifics of that system, we don't know. That's up to the Noahides. But, so, during all of this period, the Jews were living in countries as the subjects of countries, whether Muslim or Christian, in which Jewish testimony was not accepted in a Muslim court against a Muslim. And Jewish testimony was not accepted in a Christian court against a Christian. So they read the rules, and they said that's to be the same. That's the same according to rabbinic law. If there is a Jewish court, and we're talking now about civil law, right? Somebody says, this guy's truck bunked into my car, I want damages. Nobody knew about insurance at that time. So I want damages, and so bring witnesses. Okay, so the rule is, no, the witnesses are going to be Jewish, because it's the Jewish court, and that, so when Rabbi Uzziel is saying, when we have a Jewish state and we apply the rules, can we have the testimony of a non-Jewish person? This is not an innocent question, okay? He knows that if he asked anybody, well, what's on the books, they would say, can't do that, okay? So what he's now going to, what he proceeds to do in this response, in this legal brief, is to create a justification within rabbinic tradition, within rabbinic law. Why? Yes, when there will be a state of Israel, then testimony of non-Jews will be equally accepted in the civil, all matters of civil and legal judgment. So here's what he writes. It is incompatible with the quality of civil justice to disqualify the testimony of those who live with us and interact with us in good faith and integrity. You know, you have to realize, and he writes this elsewhere, he grew up in the old city of Jerusalem. The main languages in the old city of Jerusalem were Arabic, everybody spoke, Yiddish, most people spoke, including the Arabs, Ladino, which was the Yiddish of the Sephardic people, and some people who were very educated knew Turkish, but that wasn't what people spoke in the Ottoman laws were written in Turkish, but that's not what people spoke. And he grew up, and his neighbors and people all around him were Muslims and Christians in the old city of Jerusalem, and he says, it is incompatible with the quality of civil justice to disqualify the testimony of those who live with us and interact with us in good faith and integrity. And he's talking here about the non-Jewish people who are going to be living together with him in the future Jewish state. And what he's not talking about intentionally is, just a minute, for 3 years now we've had a terrible conflict. There was this uprising, and they were shooting us, we were shooting them, and so on. So he said then that was an incident. That's not the really basic way of how things should be. That's one argument. Secondly, were we ourselves not resentful when they disqualified us from testifying in the lands of our exile? He said, well, to this, okay, everybody in Israel basically has to go for national service in the army. And when you go into the army, you have basic training. The basic training is to whip you into shape that you'll know that you're going to be a soldier, and you'll take orders, and you won't think that you're going to go off do things on your own when your officer says no. And as always in that case, the commanders that take these young people and get them into shape, like in the Marines, whatever. So lots of times you find this guy, he's too hard. He's really taking advantage of his power and misusing it to really make the life miserable of the people under his command. And then what happens to a person that went through this and now he becomes a commander? So there's 2-1. One says, well, when I was young and I was in training and they mistreated me like that, now I'm going to do the same thing because now I have the power. But a different way of looking at it is saying, just a minute, how did I feel when they were doing that to me? I know, I felt terrible. And therefore what I learned from this is that now that I'm the commander, I'm going to be nice. I'm not going to let them do everything that they want, but I'm going to be a human being and I'm going to be decent and I'm not going to use this power to mistreat them. So what do you do when you had a negative experience from the side of others and now you're in that place? Okay? So Rabbi Uzziel is saying, we know how we Jews felt when we, under Muslim rule, under Christian rule, our testimony was disqualified. We felt that we were being put down. We felt that that was unfair. We felt that we are no less honest and upright than these people, so why shouldn't they accept our testimony? And it says, having that experience, now that we're going to have a state of our own, we should learn to be nice to the other people and to grant equality under the legal system and to be judged, to be witnesses to people who are non-Jewish. The third, and if in all the enlightened world it has become the rule to rely upon the testimony of any person without differentiating between religion and race, how can we practice such differentiation? Now, one way that people could respond to that is, just a minute. The enlightened world, who's the enlightened world? The enlightened world, that's the imperialists, that's the Europeans that have treated us like anti-Semitically and so on. You're telling me about the enlightened world? We should be like the enlightened world? No, we'll do our own thing. We'll follow the Torah. The Torah says, don't recognize the testimony of these people. Okay, but obviously Rabbi Uzziel is not doing that. He does accept the idea of an enlightened world. He does accept the idea that there are ideas of fairness and justice out there in modern times that Jews and the Israelites should identify with, and all of these are, to his mind, justifications for a policy that you should grant equality in civil law and testimony to people who are minorities, non-Jews, in the future Jewish state. Now, the rest of the responsum, which you don't have before you, is a very educated document in which he reads through all of the passages that seemingly disqualify non-Jews and explains how and why, with a proper understanding, this should be applied otherwise today, and this is in 1940. And now we move fast forward to 1948. What happened in 1948? Okay, so first of all, towards the end, all right, we're almost there. Today is the 21st of November, but on the 29th of November in 1947, the General Assembly of the United Nations voted that the former Palestine mandate of the British should be divided into a Jewish state and a non-Jewish state. And immediately there began acts of warfare between the Jews and Arabs in that area. And it was going to be about 6 months forward before there would be a formal declaration of independence of Israel, but there was 6 months of warfare going on between the local Jews and the local Arabs in Palestine, Israel at that time. And during that time, we don't know exactly when, but we know that it was this was published in a rabbinic journal that came out in March 1948. And he writes, how should we, he writes, Rabbi Uzziel has an article, how should we relate to the future of the Jewish state? And inter alia, he writes, neither we nor our descendants for all generations think to impose the commandments of the Torah upon the peoples and religions who reside in our land and state. We will not discriminate against them in anything, and so too, we shall not in any way harm their freedom or their religious sentiments, or the sites they have held as holy, or such sites that they may establish in the future. You may recall that under the conditions of Omar that laid out the situation of Jews and Christians in Muslim countries, they would be allowed to retain their original places of worship, but not to construct new ones. But obviously, Rabbi Uzziel is stressing that not only existing religious sites, but future Jewish sites which may be established shall not in any way be harmed. And then he writes, this is not only because of the conditions imposed upon us by the General Assembly. Okay, the General Assembly of the United Nations said that there should be a partition and each of the states should follow the basic rules of the Charter of the United Nations, which included equality, freedom, and so on and so forth. But Rabbi Uzziel is stressing, perhaps taking a jab at his Ashkenazic partner, Rabbi Herzog, at that time, who said, look, certainly Israel has to grant equality to all of the non-Jewish people in Israel, but the reason is because we only received our independence from the General Assembly under the condition that we do so. And Rabbi Uzziel is saying, therefore, it's not only because of that we're going to follow that path. Rather, we shall act thus out of our conviction and conscience, that is our heritage from our forefathers, and because of the commandment of the Torah that obligates us to accord love and honor, equality of rights and religious and national freedom to every people and to every person who resides in our country in peace and loyalty. So you see that Rabbi Uzziel was consistent, not only in 1919 when they were hoping to get a decision from the League of Nations, but also in 1940 in the wake of the general Arab uprising against the British. He didn't feel that that was changing his basic position. And in 1948, while hostilities were going on in full force, he also did not see that this was a reason to change his basic views about the position and status of non-Jews in the Jewish state. Finally, we have Rabbi Hayyim David HaLevi. Rabbi Hayyim David HaLevi, who passed away in 1998, so that's like about 20 years ago. I was even born then. And I met him and I knew him, a very interesting and open-minded and original person. And so he was asked in 1988. He was asked in 1988 to give a lecture on to a certain public forum in Israel about the status of non-Jews. What should, according to the Torah tradition and the rabbinic tradition, be the status of non-Jews in a Jewish country? And he answers that on several levels. First, he brings two matters which he feels are binding under rabbinic law, which their source is not in rabbinic law. The first one is the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel that was signed on the 15th of May, 1948. And he writes, in her Declaration of Independence, meaning the State of Israel, where Medina in Hebrew is a feminine form, so it's her, in her Declaration of Independence, it was explicitly stated that the new country will maintain complete social and political equality of rights for all other citizens without differentiation by religion, race, or gender. It follows that Israeli society owes to all its citizens, including non-Jews, the full extent of rights accorded by law to Jews. Okay, now there is a principle in the rabbinic tradition, which is, let's say, I don't have any obligation to David. I never met him before, fine person, but I never met him. But let's say, having no obligation whatsoever, I now declare before witnesses, or I write a document saying, I will give you the sum of $1,000 tomorrow. And it's signed and it's a document, right? So now that document obligates me, although until this moment I was under no obligation, right? So Rabbi Hayyim David HaLevi says the same thing is true of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. Whatever may have been the obligation of the Jews in the future state, hypothetically, under rabbinic law, which he's later going to treat, he says, since the Declaration of Independence was made and signed by the representatives of the Jewish leadership in Israel, this is an obligation that they now took upon themselves, and it has legal force. And just because of that, even if we would ignore other things, which he's not going to ignore, but he's going to take, even if we ignore that obligation itself, according to rabbinic tradition, imposes obligation upon the state of Israel and its various institutions to grant equality under law to Jews and non-Jews the same. Second consideration, we are members of the Western democratic world, in which the foundation stone of the social order is equality for all human beings. There is no place in the democratic state for discrimination on the grounds of religion. Now, once again, this has nothing to do with rabbinic law, but it's a matter of choice. And in fact, in 1947, when there was that vote in the United Nations, the Soviet Union voted in favor of the partition of the Palestine into two states, meaning the mandate, which until then had no sovereign nations because it was under the British, would now be divided into two sovereign states. And the Russians voted in favor of that. And one of their hopes was that since so many of the founders of the Zionist enterprise had come from Eastern Europe, and they were socialists, and many of them were Marxists, and that's why they had kibbutzim, where everybody is equal, and so on. The Soviets hoped that perhaps the newly founded Jewish state would not join the Western democracies, but would join the people's democracies and establish that type of regime. And Rabbi Uzziel is saying, no, we are members of the Western democratic world, so when he's talking about the Western world, he knows there's an Iron Curtain, okay? And he's sort of, in that sense, choosing sides. Even before the state of Israel was, no, I mean, he's choosing sides, Rabbi Hayyim David HaLevi, and he's saying we are part of that, and we want to be part of that. And to be part of that, that means that we also choose the notion of equality for all human beings. But then he says, let's imagine that there never was the Declaration of Independence as it was formulated. Let's imagine that there was no Western democratic world. We just had to rely upon Jewish sources. What would it look like then? And he says, well, first of all, I'm bringing you the verse from the book of Genesis, which he's later going to relate to. And it says in the 5th chapter of Genesis, this is the book of the lineage of Adam, the first human. On the day God created Adam, in the image of God, he created him. Adam wasn't Jewish. He was human. So this is saying something about all humans. And on this, now Rabbi Hayyim David HaLevi is writing, it is self-evident that all human beings are created in divine image. I don't know if he read the Declaration of Independence of the United States as self-evident, but the Hebrew is muvan me'elav, which is self-evident. And therefore, all persons from all nations of the world can become righteous men and attain high spiritual degrees by virtue of the spirit of life that God instilled in Adam, father of all humanity. This is why Ben Azai held that the verse, this is the book of Adam's descendants, is of greater significance than the verse, love thy neighbor as thyself. Love thy neighbor as thyself is talking about people who are around you, right? Your neighbors. What about the other people that you can't see? They're somewhere beyond the mountain in a different country. Do you have any obligation to them? If you just go according to love your neighbor as yourself, it's not self-evident. But Ben Azai, who was a great rabbinic scholar from the 2nd century of the Common Era, said, well, there's another verse that's more encompassing than love your neighbor. This is the book of Adam's descendants. Clearly, Ben Azai sought to indicate not the opening words of the verse, it's the descendants, but, which are in themselves meaningless, but rather its conclusion, he, meaning God, made him, Adam, in the image of God. Therefore, this verse from Genesis states something which is not dependent on the Declaration of Independence. It's not dependent on the notion of democracy and equality, which you could probably argue pretty well was derived in the Western world from the humanistic Christian tradition, which came ultimately from this biblical verse itself. So he's going back to the Bible, and he says that's this is self-evident. Then he says, the Gentile nations of our time do not have the halachic, the legal status of pagans. As you know from reading the Bible, despite the fact that all human beings are created in God's image, the Bible and the prophets have a big issue with paganism and idolatry, which they feel are barbaric, and therefore, despite that, all of the pagan people were human beings. But since they had these barbarous forms of worship, these barbarian forms of worship, there's a lot of rules in the rabbinic tradition against such people. But, says Rabbi Hayyim David HaLevi, that's not the people that we have today. That's not the people that we have today. The people that we have today are people who are not part of that ancient pagan world, and therefore we have no reason to be antagonistic towards them, and they are human beings. We are human beings, they're human beings, and this verse, these verses, this outlook from the book of Genesis obligates us, and therefore he concludes, the entire range of relations between Jews and non-Jews, both in Israel and abroad, both with regard to the relation of society as a state to its non-Jewish citizens, and with regard to the relation of the individual, meaning the Jewish individual, to his non-Jewish neighbor or friend, in all matters of livelihood, visiting the sick, burying the dead, consoling the mourners, etc., all of this should be done out of a human moral obligation. And I will conclude, and then if people would like to make comments or questions, there's people read, so there are various rabbis who read the Bible, and there's two groups. I'll put it sort of schematically. One group says, well, if you read the book of Genesis, you see that the first thing happened was there were two brothers, right? Adam and Eve had two sons, Cain and Abel. Cain killed Abel. God punished him. Just a minute. Did God ever say to Cain, thou shalt not kill? No. But the Bible assumes that Cain was supposed to have an innate morality which told him you can't do that, and it's not whether God told you or not, you have to know it by yourself. In fact, the whole continuation of then there comes the flood. According to the biblical story, why did the flood come? People were acting horribly. Just a minute, but did ever God say God commanded them, don't act horribly? No, they were supposed to know that. Okay, so the whole book of, then later on in a recent part of the book that was read in the synagogues, Abraham or Isaac, who was it, takes his wife to a neighboring country and he says, tell them that you're my sister, because I'm worried that if you don't tell them that you're my sister, they're going to kill me. And God appears in a dream to the king of that country. He said, you're in big trouble. You don't know that that's Abraham's wife? Why did you intend to marry her? And the king says to God in the story, just a minute. Just a minute. I'm a righteous person. I didn't do anything intentionally against Abraham. He misled me. Are you now going to take it out on me? That's not right. And God says, correct. It's not fair. I'm not going to do it. So they all were operating under a notion of fairness and morality that was innate, and it's not coming from God's commandments. Then, after some time in the biblical story, the Israelites go down to Egypt. They come out of Egypt, and there's a whole big revelation of God in Mount Sinai, and they receive the Torah. Okay, so now that the Israelite people receive the Torah, it gives them many instructions what to do. What about the fact that previously everybody was operating under an innate sense of morality? Where did that innate sense of morality now go once that the Israelite people have the Torah? So there's a certain school of thought which says, well, all of the rest of the peoples of the world, they didn't get the Torah, so they have to continue going according to the original innate morality. But the Israelites, they don't need that anymore. Why? Because they now have the direct commandments of God, how to act. So everybody in the world could go according to innate morality, and the Israelites are going to go according to what? The rules that God commanded them directly. Under this idea, if you would come to a Jewish person somewhere in the southern Sahara and he's doing something wrong, and you say to him, but that's immoral. So what he might answer you under this framework? I could care less. I'm obligated by what's written in the Torah and the rules of God. He told me directly, and in this case, he didn't tell me anything about this. Okay, so I'm not bound by morality. I'm bound by the direct commandments of God. Okay, but there's a different school of thought, which my good friend Avi Sagi wrote about, and apparently it's the majority of rabbis hold this. The thing that I just told you about is called divine command morality in ethics, right? What God commands, that's good. If God doesn't command it or doesn't take a position, it's irrelevant. It has no moral value one way or another. Okay, but the other view, which apparently is held by most rabbis of our generation, and it's clearly held by Rabbi Hayyim David HaLevi, is when the Israelite people, according to the Bible, received the Torah and they received direct commands of God, that's not instead of morality. It's in addition to morality. So the Jews, like all human beings, are obligated by morality. And in addition, they have additional special rules and obligations which God gave to them and is not incumbent upon other people. So obviously what Rabbi Hayyim David HaLevi is saying here in this last paragraph is that given the fact that all human beings are created together in the image of God and they're basically equal, and we're not talking about pagans or barbarous people. We're talking about other human beings living together with us in other places in the world. All of this should be done out of a human moral obligation, which obligates Jewish and non-Jewish people equally to live together to the best extent that they could in peace and harmony and mutual respect. And therefore, this is also incumbent upon the political and legal framework of the State of Israel. Okay, that's it from my side, and I'll be happy to take any questions or comments.
We're actually a little bit over schedule, so please keep your questions to the point so we can accommodate as many as possible.